So once again, welcome Keaton Halley to speak for us.
All right. Good evening. Welcome back. For anyone that wasn't here this morning, we are Creation Ministries International, and we aim to show that the book of Genesis gives us the true history of the origin of all things. So we're a ministry that defends the truth of God's word, and especially how science aligns with Scripture in regard to origins, the whole controversy of creation versus evolution. And we talked this morning about a lot of dead things, rocks and fossils, right? But this evening we're going to focus on biological concerns, because this whole debate involves that subject as well. And I want to make a case that the Bible tells the truth about biology and how living things came about. So did living things come about because they were engineered by an ingenious creator, as the Bible teaches, or did they come about through unguided naturalistic evolutionary processes, as Darwin believed and popularized? And he did propose his theory as a specific alternative to design. Well, it's always struck me when you talk even to non-believers, anyone in the world, no matter what their worldview, when we are looking out at the world of living things, whether we're talking about the grandeur of one of nature's greatest beasts, or perhaps the tiny intricate details of the eye of an insect, for example, everyone's first impression is that someone must have made these things. That's at least what it appears at first blush. And you don't have to be a Christian to see that. Living things are beautiful, they have sophisticated complexity, they appear to be designed, and that would therefore imply a designer. The Bible affirms this intuition that we all have, that even young children can see. In Romans chapter 1, verse 20, for example, it says, "For since the creation of the world," it's speaking of God here, it says his, or God's, invisible attributes are clearly seen. Notice it's obvious, this verse is saying, that God is real. And specific things we can know about him, some of his attributes, like, or it says here, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Even his eternal power and Godhead, there's a couple of attributes, right? That he's very powerful, and that he is God who is the designer. It's not just some vague, intelligent designer. In fact, this verse says it's so obvious that God is real, known by the creation, which implies a creator, that people have no excuse not to believe in him. Nobody could stand up on Judgment Day, that's coming in the future for us, and look God in the eye and say, I didn't have any reason to believe. There was no evidence. God can say it was all around you in the creation. But it's not just Christians and the Bible that affirm this view. As I say, even many atheists would admit the world at least looks like it was designed. Surprisingly, men like Richard Dawkins, for example, maybe the world's leading atheist today, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which is all about making this case that you don't need a watchmaker to make a watch, a complex object. Evolution is the blind watchmaker. You can have, all the complexity in living things without a designer. But look how he defines biology on page 1. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. That's amazing. He doesn't himself believe living things were designed for a purpose, but he admits it looks that way. And so the whole rest of his book he spends trying to explain away the appearance of design as an illusion. And others make similar statements. Take Francis Crick, for example, one of the people that co-discovered DNA, the structure of DNA. He was able to crack that and propose that there was a genetic code. Amazing. He recognized that those letters in the DNA were symbols that were like a language encoding a message. And he himself is an atheist as well, sadly, and he says this: biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Well, why do these brilliant men of science have to keep reminding themselves that evolution is true in their minds? Because even to them, the world looks like it was designed. So the real question is the design real, or is it just apparent? Is it an illusion? And to be fair to these atheists, sometimes we can think we're seeing design that implicates a designer, when in fact we're just being fooled. One of my favorite examples of this would be back in 1976, when the Voyager spacecraft was flying out past some of the planets like Mars, and it took some close-up photos of the Martian landscape from directly above. And so you see a bunch of craters there and some hills. And one of the details I've cropped here so you can see, dead center is a hillside from up above that looks like a face was carved into it, staring out into space. And some people at the time got all excited about this. They called it the face on Mars and said it's evidence for intelligent extraterrestrials, Martians who must have carved this hillside. But I'm seeing lots of laughs in the crowd, right? Because we can tell in this case that could be explained as an accidental byproduct of natural processes alone. Gravity, wind, erosion, because the appearance of a face is fairly superficial. It's not super detailed, right? And so it shouldn't surprise anyone that when we got better satellites mapping out this same hillside from a different angle, it doesn't look, I skipped ahead here. It doesn't look very much like a face, right? You can't explain that by natural processes alone. But by contrast, if the satellites had flown past that hillside and seen something like this, then nobody would say that can be explained without a designer. No, it requires intelligence because the level of detail in this resemblance it has to a face is uncanny and complex and sophisticated and clear. There's no way you would say that was an accident by natural processes, blind forces alone. It must implicate a designer. And so the atheists want to say, you see, design is like that first instance where we think we're seeing a face. Turns out it's not a designer who made that at all. Design is an illusion. I want to say it's like this second example of the Martian face carved into a hillside. That's what life is like. It exhibits telltale features of a designer that are unmistakable. But to show that this is the case, let's walk through 4 different reasons many evolutionists would give for believing in evolution. And these are the kinds of things that you'll read in high school biology textbooks, ways that they indoctrinate students, for example. And we'll explore all these 4 areas. It's kind of going to be an outline for our message this evening. And then I'm going to show you along the way how each one of these actually better supports creation. So we're going to look at, number 1, vestigial structures. I'll unpack what that term means if you've not heard the word vestigial before. Then we'll talk about the similarities in living things. Next, we'll look at the changes that we can observe in real time. And last, we'll talk about the cruelty in nature. So let's take them one by one. And I want to argue that when you examine the details, the impression of design does not disappear, it grows even stronger. So first, vestigial structures. What are those? Well, the word vestige just means a remnant or a trace of something. So say if you are walking along the beach on the shore and you see some footprints in the sand, that's a vestige that a human being once walked there. And so the evolutionists claim that in the human body, for example, there are all kinds of vestigial parts of our bodies, organs, structures, that don't have a function today, but once did long ago in our evolutionary past. And it demonstrates that humans inherited these structures from our animal ancestors. And I'm sure you've heard of many of these things, like the tonsils, the human appendix, the human tailbone, goosebumps, many other things evolutionists claim don't serve any purpose. They're not something a designer would have put there because they're useless body parts and just point to our evolutionary history. Now, it's not as though creationists would deny that there's any such thing as a vestigial structure, because we believe, even though God created things good in the beginning, since the time of the fall, lots of harmful deterioration has occurred. Things can get broken and no longer function. And although we don't believe that we inherited any vestigial organs from animals, it is true that we might find here or there something that doesn't work in our bodies. It might be broken. That's not inconsistent with the Bible. And there are real vestigial organs I could point to, like in dark caves, many of the animals that you find there where no light penetrates, they are born blind with just scar tissue where their eyes once were in their ancestors, in ordinary fish, because being able to see in a dark cave doesn't help you at all. And so it could be that random mutations destroyed the genetic information they had from the beginning that enabled them to make eyes. And so now, when these animals grow from their eggs, they are blind to begin with. They also lose the pigmentation in their skin, by the way, because again, what difference does it make whether you have the pigment in your skin if you're in a dark cave where there's no light? And so evolutionists try to point to this as proof of evolution. You see, the fish have changed over time. Yeah, but creationists acknowledge changes occur. These are downhill changes, destroying structures like eyes. We don't want the evolutionists to explain how to remove eyes that once existed. We want them to explain how to invent eyes in the first place. Can natural processes do that? So the scar tissue, damaged eyes that no longer work, would be a genuine vestigial organ. But the problem is, evolutionists have said all kinds of things in the human body are vestigial, and that turns out not to be the case. This year is the 100-year anniversary of the famous Scopes monkey trial, 1925, and some of the evolutionist scientists that actually got to testify in that court trial and give expert testimony to try to prove evolution, one of the evidences they marshaled was, don't you know, we have all kinds of vestigial organs in our bodies, no less than 180, they said back then. But it turns out, since that time, we have found functions for essentially every single one of these features. And so they were just ignorant of the function back then. It wasn't good proof of evolution. It was an argument from ignorance. So as some particular examples here, in 2017, I visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and I took a photo of a sign they have there that's about the human tailbone called the coccyx. The coccyx, the tailbone, that's that little triangular process at the back of your pelvis. You've got this big bone called the sacrum, and just beneath that is a little triangular, upside-down triangular bone. That's the coccyx, the tailbone. Now look at what the sign says. I was astonished to read this. Look closely at the base of the human spine, and you'll find a tailbone, 3 to 5 vertebrae fused together. It serves no purpose, except it reminds us that humans have descended from ancestral animals with tails. Is that really proof that we came from apes and monkeys before that? Not at all. The reason I was so shocked is because to say this serves no purpose is absurd. When you consult experts on anatomy and physiology, they tell you different functions that the tailbone has. It is an important anchor point for a whole variety of attached ligaments, muscles, tendons, and those muscles and so forth, they're doing things in our bodies. Even though if the connection gets severed, you know, some people like fall on their tailbone and break it, and you know, even some people have had it removed after these injuries. You can live without it, but that doesn't prove it's non-functional, just like you can live without your arms and your legs, right? Doesn't prove that they serve no purpose. And the rest of your body has to work harder to make up for the lack of the tailbone if it is removed. And so those muscles help to like just hold in the like hammock-like pelvic floor of your body to keep your organs in place. The tailbone also serves as a weight-bearing structure. When you're seated, you have kind of 2 bones in the front of your pelvis, and the tailbone is like the third leg of a tripod in the back. So as you lean back, it helps to bear more of your weight. Those muscles also perform other functions having to do with giving birth in women and using the restroom daily, things that men and women both do, important functions that are connected to that anchor site of the tailbone. But we could talk about other alleged vestigial structures. What about the appendix? That is this little worm-like process that comes off your large intestine there. Well, it's clear that the appendix has some functions that we're still somewhat in the dark about because there's a lot of tissue that's involved in immune functions in our body. We don't fully understand how it's involved in the immune system, but it's clear that it does have immune functions. One of the other purposes, though, that we are familiar with for the appendix is that it's called a safe house for good bacteria. We have a lot of bacteria in our gut that are supposed to be there. They aid in digestion, but sometimes when we get certain illnesses, we expel those bacteria from our gut. And how do they get replenished? Well, they can come from that storage facility, the appendix, and allow us to recover from diseases more quickly than we would without them. But even if we're still learning about the functions of the appendix, it's very clear, even if you grant an evolutionary perspective
they must concede the appendix has a function. If you read the article on the screen, it talks about this, the web link there, because in the evolutionary tree of very different organisms, they realize different animals have different types of appendixes, and some have it and others don't have one. And if you follow the evolutionary tree and say all these creatures are related to one another, they say the appendix had to evolve not just once, but 18 different times on separate branches of the evolutionary tree by pure coincidence. Because you can't explain it all from a common ancestor. And so if the appendix is so useless, why has it evolved again and again and again and again? Clearly, even from their point of view, it must have an important function. Now, there are many other examples that we could walk through, but you could consult our literature for that. I think in general, the Bible has the best explanation for the human body. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, that my soul knows very well. So far from having all kinds of vestigial structures, those have been debunked in modern times. And yet the evolutionists continue to make claims along these lines about junk in our DNA. Have you heard of the claim of junk DNA before? Well, that also has fallen by the wayside in just the past few years. That was something evolutionists claimed decades ago. Some stragglers are still hanging on to that view, but we're finding more and more functions for these parts of our genome that they formerly said were just leftover garbage from our evolutionary history. No, that's again an argument from ignorance. The more we discover, the more we find these parts of our bodies are indeed performing complex functions. So let's move on to the second argument that supposedly demonstrates the truth of evolution, that is the similarities in living things. Now, this is one that's very widespread and applies to lots of different organisms. A typical example that they'll give you in like high school biology textbooks would be what's called the pentadactyl or 5-digit limb pattern in these organisms that creationists would say are not all related. Like we're not related to frogs, right, or birds or seals. And yet, look at the similarities in the bones here. All these creatures have, sometimes in arms and legs, one bone in the upper arm, then an elbow joint, 2 bones in the lower arm, and then a wrist joint, and then 5 digits in the hand. And what's kind of surprising is even in creatures that you might not expect it, where they don't actually have like 5 fingers or 5 toes, like the bird wing or horses even have this same pattern. It's in lots and lots of vertebrates. And so the evolutionists say, see, there you go. This must be the reason for this similarity is because all these creatures had a common ancestor millions of years prior, one ancestor that gave rise to all of them that already had that 5-digit limb bone pattern in place, and evolution just tweaked the design or the pattern in these various organisms to serve different purposes. But is that proven? Is that the only way to interpret the facts? Not at all. Creationists can say, well, there's not one common ancestor for all these creatures. Rather, there's one common designer who's responsible for creating all these creatures. And why would a designer make all these diverse limbs in different creatures so similar? Well, a number of reasons. Number one, there are good engineering reasons for many of the types of twists and turns that our limbs perform. And even robotic arms often have some of these same features. But there could be additional reasons, like aesthetic purposes. Musicians, artists repeat themes in their work, and maybe God wanted to reveal that it was He Himself, one designer that's behind all living things, rather than polytheism, a variety of gods. But are we just sort of at a standoff where the creationists can give one explanation, the evolutionists can give another? No, because I think just like the Martian landscape, when you look at the details, the evolutionary story begins to fall apart. So, for example, if the reason for the similarity is because with humans and frogs, that the common ancestor of both already had that 5-digit pattern, then you would expect that the human and frog limbs would develop in very much the same way. Like as the embryo is developing, these limbs would form by the same processes. But actually they do not. They arrive at the same conclusion by different methods. So the human hand in embryonic stage begins like a plate as the baby grows in the womb, and the material between the fingers dissolves away, whereas the frog foot begins like a stump and the digits grow outward from initial buds. So isn't that interesting? Maybe God did it that way on purpose just to defy these evolutionary ideas. And there are many other examples of uncanny similarities in living things that no evolutionist would say is a result of common ancestry. Take, for example, the similarities between the vertebrate eye, like we humans have. It's a camera lens system, very different than an insect eye, for example. But octopuses, they're not even vertebrates, supposed to be way far away from us on the evolutionary tree, and yet they also have this camera lens eye. So what's the evolutionary explanation? A common designer, that the common ancestor of humans and octopuses that long ago already had this camera lens eye? No, of course not. They say on separate branches of the evolutionary tree, just like the appendix evolving over and over, the eye, a camera lens eye, evolved more than once. And then you've got insect eyes, different types of eyes in nature that all evolved independently as well. You folks thought it was hard enough to evolve an eye even once by natural processes alone. With all its complexity, the evolutionists believe that it's happened over and over again. Here's what John Rennie, the editor of Scientific American, says. It now appears that in various families of organisms, eyes have evolved independently. Some evolutionists say as many as 60 times or more that eyes evolved. I don't think so. Blind forces of nature cannot make a seeing eye. Here too, I think the Bible has a better explanation. In Proverbs, we read that the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. When you think about this similarity concept as an argument for evolution, generally speaking, I think logically it just fails because there are so many manufactured objects, man-made things that also exhibit these patterns of similarity. And not just similarity from one thing to another, but you can group the similarities into a tree diagram. If you could dump out the silverware in your kitchen drawer one day, and you can probably arrange it into an evolutionary tree, put closer things that are more similar together, right? The spoons and forks and knives all evolved from a common ancestor. No, they're man-made objects. They're designed by intelligent agents. Same thing with vehicles, right? Automobiles. Did a unicycle evolve into a bicycle, to a tricycle, to a vehicle with four wheels, and so on? Eventually the space shuttle. No, they're designed objects. Or Mexican food, right? Maybe new Mexican food that you have around here. The taco and the nachos and tamales all evolved from just the bare tortilla millions of years ago. Not at all, because these patterns of similarity don't prove evolution. They're consistent with what designers do on a regular basis. So we've looked at two arguments for evolution, vestigial structures and similarities in living things. Let's consider a third. That would be the changes that we observe in organisms today. Because animals do adapt to their environments. Bacteria become resistant to antibiotics, right? And evolutionists often point to the changes we see and say, aha, that's evolution in action. How can you creationists deny it? But they're often portraying a straw man, as if creationists don't believe in any types of change. But even before Charles Darwin wrote, creationists understood that God's designed kinds of organisms could adapt and could undergo significant changes. They understood what human breeders were able to do with dogs, for example. Here's a lot of the variety in domestic dogs. And people before Darwin understood that human agents were responsible in kind of generating these new breeds by selecting wolves and different types of dogs and breeding ones together that were more similar, trying to derive certain specific traits. But the creationists also recognized that these changes had limits. But it's clear that they knew that things like Great Danes and poodles and Chihuahuas, these weren't around back at the time of Adam and Eve, because they're modern developments from the potential for variety God built into living things from the beginning. And the Bible would actually lead us to expect that there's a lot of change that is possible from basic types of organisms, because the Bible teaches at the time of Noah, most of the animals were wiped out. For all the land vertebrates, the only ones that survived were those aboard Noah's Ark. Two of the unclean animals and 7 of a limited subset, the clean animals, 7 pairs actually. And so they reasoned, even before Darwin, that how do we explain all the diversity among land vertebrates today? Well, all of them are descended from those original pairs of animals aboard the ark. And so elephants and mammoths and mastodons and different things, they're all derived from a single pair aboard the ark. Noah didn't have to take 2 of each one of those varieties. So the Bible would even, and ordinary observations about the world would lead us to expect that there is significant development and changes possible within animal kinds. And yet, they also reasoned from Scripture that the changes have limits, because in Genesis 1, 10 times it uses the phrase that God made these plants and animals after their kinds or according to their kinds. And so that meant he supernaturally created them separately from one another. You can't say that all types of life can be traced back to a single common ancestor. And some of these were even made on different days of creation week, right? Like the swimming creatures and flying creatures, there were different groups of them, and they were made separately on a different day from the land-based animals, and mankind was made special as well, where God said, let us make man in our image. Not just let there be, but let us make a more personal account of how he brought man from the dust and Eve out of his rib. But it's important to understand the Bible does not say that God made every single species of creature in the beginning. And there was an old idea floating around in Darwin's time about a fixity of species view that said God made each species separately and the species don't change. No, many creationists at the time recognized that was incorrect, just as Charles Darwin did. And that's because the Bible doesn't say God made each species, it says he made the distinct kinds of animals. And it turns out within a biblical kind, you can have adaptation, development, changes that leads to speciation and multiple species within one single kind. So for example, all the cats in the world, creationists have good reason to believe are related. Came from just 2 cats off of Noah's Ark. So Noah didn't have to bring 2 lions and 2 tigers and 2 leopards and 2 lynxes and so on. And today we classify these as different species, but that doesn't mean that lions were there in the Garden of Eden. No, it was the original cat kind. Same thing aboard the ark, just 2 cats. And these are modern varieties developed over several thousand years after the time of Noah's flood. And how can we tell if that view is right? How can we tell if lions and tigers are one kind or 2 distinct kinds? Well, one method to test is if we can breed these animals together and they're capable of producing offspring, that suggests they are one kind. And do you know what you get if you cross a male lion with a female tiger? You get a liger. So these are actually real, large, healthy cats, not mythical beasts with magical powers. If you go the other way, male as a tiger, then it's a tigon. And this is just one example. There are many different hybrids among the mammals that would show this same thing, that the biblical kind is broader than a modern-day species. Do you know what you get if you cross a camel with a llama? It makes a comma. How about a cow with a buffalo makes a beefalo? Zebra and a donkey makes a zonkey. Zebra and a horse makes a zorse. A goat and a sheep makes a jeep. No, actually it's pronounced geep, because a jeep is what you drive, right? And by the way, there are geeps that are chimeras, like artificially produced by scientists in the lab, but actually natural hybrids occur too, and they're also called geeps. Here's a pig and a boar cross. In the wild, they discovered that polar bears sometimes mate with grizzly bears and produce pizzly bears. And even at SeaWorld, they had a tank one time that contained both a bottlenose dolphin alongside what's called a false killer whale. It's not a true killer whale, but it's very much like that, much larger than a dolphin. And so they didn't think that these two were capable of breeding together, and yet one of them became pregnant, and along came a baby wolfen calf eventually. So what's the point of going through all this? It shows that the biblical kind is broader than a modern-day species. And that helps to explain how you could fit all the animals aboard the ark. Noah didn't have to bring 2 of every single species in the world. He didn't have to bring any aquariums. All the animals in the water could survive a flood fine. He didn't have to bring all the insects on board as obligate passengers. But he did bring 2 of all the land vertebrate kinds rather than species. And so I think students a lot of times get confused when they're in their classroom. Some professor says, how can you deny evolution? I can observe it. I see it happening in my lab. It's a fact. But what's he observing is variations on a theme, changes within a kind, whereas that word evolution is a slippery word. It can have multiple meanings, right? And so just because he sees some changes that creationists would agree with doesn't mean that evolution in the grand sense is true. And the student is being led to believe not just that butterflies can change and adapt. He's being led to believe that microbes turn into mankind over millions of years. And that's the evolution we object to. And we try to even avoid using that term evolution for these smaller variations. But it's really not just the size of the variation that's the difference. I think it's very different types of changes that we're observing. The changes that evolutionists observe in the laboratory, and creationists do as well, these are not the types of changes that even if you gave them millions of years would add up to big macro-scale Darwinian type evolution. And why not? Well, I think there are genetic reasons that there are limits to the changes that can occur. Because, as we mentioned before, DNA contains a language. Did you know DNA stands for definitely no accident? I'm not sure if you knew that's what DNA stands for, but it contains, in the human body, for example, as Richard Dawkins says, there's enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. And so the challenge for evolutionists who want to say that all the diversity in living things came about through natural processes alone without intelligent agency is how can natural processes write information? How can it create new information that did not exist before in the whole biosphere? And if evolution were true, that would have to be the case, because in their story, think about when the first life evolved and there were single-celled creatures that had some amount of DNA, but they did not, in these like amoebas or whatever they were, these single-celled creatures, they did not have the genetic instructions to make, say, tree bark. Trees had not yet evolved. How did the instructions, the complex genes and so forth to make tree bark get created? And what about later in the evolutionary story when trees had come about, but there were no birds yet? Where did the instructions in our DNA to make feathers come from? If the evolutionary story is true about natural processes producing all the variety of creatures we have ever had, then it has to be the types of changes that are capable of generating new genetic information, not just destroying it and removing it or sorting it out. It has to be brand new genetic information. And so when evolutionists point to changes that they see, oh, this is how evolution happening right now. We see bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics and so forth, and animals adapting. Yeah, we do, but are those changes information gains or information losses? And it turns out in essentially every case that we know of, there information losses. I'll talk about a few possible exceptions in a minute. It's really easy to fall down the stairs, but evolutionists want us to say that things fell up the stairs all the way to the top. But genetically, informationally, things are going downhill. So if we look at the claimed mechanism of how they say evolution takes place, the one that's taught in the textbooks typically, which is like the most compelling mechanism they have, it's called the neo-Darwinian mechanism, which involves natural selection acting on random mutations. So let's look at those processes and see if it adds new information to the genome. First, natural selection. Now, creationists agree that natural selection really does occur because we already talked about how humans can get involved in the process, and through artificial, through artificial selection, we can push the animals to go in a certain direction and develop certain breeds. But in the wild, this happens as well, naturally. So how did we get these differences among the different types of canines? Wolves and coyotes and domestic dogs, dingoes and jackals. Well, it's natural selection that's involved in sorting out the information that God built into the original ancestor of these creatures to begin with. And how does it work? Well, let me give you a simplified example of how the genetics of natural selection can happen and show that it's nevertheless a loss of information. So imagine there are a couple of wolves or dogs aboard Noah's Ark, and after they come off the ark, they're going to breed and start multiplying and spread around the world. But let's say there are a couple of genes that code for the length of their fur. And some genes work like this where they have a blended effect. So if we say an L version of the gene represents long fur and an S version of the gene represents short fur, then the dogs themselves, externally on the surface, they're going to have medium fur like you see here. But when they get married, or however you put that, when they have offspring, their puppies are going to have a random combination of one gene from dad, one gene from mom here. And so some of the dogs will get an S from both parents. And what kind of fur will they have? They'll have short fur, right? No long fur genes. What about the majority of dogs, about 50%? I guess that's not technically a majority. 50% roughly will have an L from mom and an S from dad, or the other way around. So they'll have the same medium length fur. And about 25% will have long fur, just get an L from dad, L from mom. So look, in one generation, you can have a lot of variety. On the surface, you've gone from medium fur dogs to a whole panoply, short fur to long fur. But is that evolution so far? No, because have you added new genetic information? No, you've just sorted out the information that was already pre-programmed in these creatures. But here's where natural selection comes in. Let's say that all these dogs, a population with a range of fur lengths, are living in an area, and suddenly there's a very harsh winter, maybe even an ice age that comes on after the flood. Which dogs are going to survive in a super, super cold winter? Only the dogs with the longest fur, right? So let's kill off all the other dogs with medium fur and short fur. Only the long fur dogs survive. And then when these long fur dogs have puppies, what will they look like? There's only L genes left, right? They're going to have long fur. So that's natural selection in action, a kind of simplified version of it. The principles here apply to more complex circumstances, but the point is, what's happened on the surface? We've gone from medium fur to long fur. We've adapted to a cold environment, but have we gained information? No, we've removed information, the genes for short fur. And so can you see how this process has limits? If you put the long fur dogs back in a super, super hot summer someplace, they're going to die of heat stroke. They're not going to, adapt back in the other direction unless somewhere in the population there are some of those short fur genes. So natural selection, if you just think about even the name itself, all it can do is select from what's already available. It's not creating anything fundamentally new. And so that's why we go from the more robust wolf-like ancestor down to our domestic varieties of dogs. We do that largely by removing information, by sorting out, getting rid of the genes for bigness, and you can create a smaller dog, for example. And you can get to the point where you've got very little information left at all, because Chihuahuas are swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool, sadly. But it's not just natural selection that makes these dogs weak and susceptible to diseases and all sorts of things. We call these dogs purebreds sometimes, one that have a lot of their information removed so that they've lost the genes for bigness and pointy ears. They've got floppy ears or whatever. We call them purebreds, but that's a synonym for inbreds if you think about it, right? They're not mating with the more robust ancestor type, and they've got lots of problems therefore. And some of those problems arise from the other part of the evolutionary mechanism, at least what is claimed, and that is mutations. Let's talk about mutations and see whether that can increase the information in the genome. Because informed evolutionists would say, yeah, of course, natural selection by itself is not going to give you new information. The raw material comes from random mutations. Now, mutations are also something creationists can observe, and we agree with. A lot of these mutations are single letter changes in the DNA. And so it's usually a copying mistake that happens as the DNA from the parent is being copied to be given to the offspring. So you might have a dog with healthy, long legs. There's a copying mistake as it's transferred to his puppies, and they're born with short, stubby little legs. And so it would be very much like if you're typing out a phrase on a keyboard and you accidentally hit the wrong key, a mutation is like a typo. So instead of writing you, you put you knew. So is that a good example, therefore, of a gain of information? If you make a mistake on the keyboard, you have changed the phrase to something different than it was originally, but I submit it's not a gain of information in this case because there is no word you knew in the English language. It's gobbledygook. And that same idea applies to biology. Most of the mutations that are happening in DNA will not produce something else that helps the organism to live better or create a new complex piece of machinery that's beneficial in some way. It's just destroying the complex instructions that are already there. It's producing gobbledygook, genetically speaking, not creating new information that's conducive to life. Now, that's not to say that it's absolutely impossible in principle that a mutation just by chance could ever cause an information gain. For example, this sign from a parking lot, there's also a typo there in that sign, if you notice, and it changed the meaning from what was intended, and yet it is just by chance creating a new meaning, right? New information. It sounds pretty good to me. Violators will be towed and fined $50. Of course, the tow probably costs more than $50, so. But let's look at some particular examples and see how it's pretty obvious in most cases. You can understand intuitively how this would be very, very rare with English letters, even more rare in genes, because a lot of times, one gene can code for multiple different transcripts. It's read by different methods. Like sometimes it'll be read forward and backwards and give two different messages. Or it'll be read forward, but like spliced out different parts and recombined to form a whole bunch of different things that'll be functional. And so if you change a letter that might improve one reading, it's going to mess up the other dozen or more at the same time. And so it's not going to improve the organism overall. But it is pretty obvious how, in most cases, mutations are harming the organism and not creating new information. So, for instance, this poor rooster has a mutation that destroyed his ability to make feathers. And so he never grew feathers. We call this the TNR mutation, which stands for totally naked rooster. It's an obvious loss of genetic information, right? But sometimes it might not be as obvious. Like this poor creature here is also a bird. When it's healthy without the mutation, it looks like that. It's a budgie. But this little guy called a whipper, you can watch YouTube videos of him online hopping around. He's alive. He can't fly very well, obviously. What's happened is his mutation made his feathers keep growing and growing and growing and not stop. And they just curl up and so forth. So some people might think, well, there's a good example of a mutation that's caused the gain of information. His feathers grow more than they did before. But no, what's happening here is the healthy birds have switches in their DNA to switch off the feathers and make them stop growing at a certain point. And the mutant bird has had that switch damaged, so he can no longer stop. It's less specificity in his DNA, so it's a loss of information. What about when genes get copied or various ways that genetic instructions can be duplicated? Like this turtle is a mutant. It has 2 heads. It's not ninja as far as I know, but it is a mutant turtle. Well, is that a good example of new information arising naturally? Well, I don't think so. If you read the newspaper and then read it again a second time, are you twice as informed? Only if you have a bad memory or didn't read very carefully the first time, right? We don't, again, want evolutionists to explain how to get a copy of a head. Once we've already got the instructions to make a head, that's easy to explain. We want them to tell us, how do natural processes alone produce one of these heads in the first place before there was genetic instructions for a turtle head anywhere in the world? Now, at the same time, I will say there could be cases of duplications of DNA that may, in some trivial technical sense, increase information, because the way some genes and things are expressed, it depends on how many copies are produced. And so if you have a duplication, it can make more copies, and it may speed up certain reactions and things like that. And so in some very trivial sense, a duplication may increase the information content of the genome. But again, that's not the type of information increase that we want evolutionists to explain to us. How do we get brand new instructions that we never had before, not merely duplications? And last, I want to talk about how we should be careful not to say, as creationists, that there's no such thing as a beneficial mutation, because there are mutations that can benefit organisms in the sense that they help them to survive. But even these cases that evolutionists love to point to and say, see, this mutation helped the organism adapt to its environment better, even these cases turn out to be defects. And defects can be helpful in certain circumstances. So one great example of this would be something Charles Darwin himself observed on his famous voyage on the Beagle, where he sailed to this archipelago, the Galapagos Islands. On some of these islands that were quite windy, he observed that the beetles that lived on these islands had no wings, but when he compared them to other beetles that lived nearby on the mainland, it's the same type of beetle, but they did have wings. So why would the beetles on the island not have wings? Darwin concluded it looks like their ancestors flew here from the mainland, but then somehow over time they lost the ability to construct wings. And I think Darwin was absolutely right about that. And he tried to explain why this might be the case, and he thought because if you have wings as a beetle on these windy islands, maybe if you fly around, you're more likely to get blown into the sea and drown. Now, modern scientists often say that there's probably more likely explanations about it would just be a lot of energy expended to fly around on a windy island. And so it's easier to crawl to look for food and to find a mate. You don't need wings to help you do those things, and so they would be lost because they're not needed, and maybe just accidental mutations knock them out. Or, as we're now learning it with many of these types of cases, it may be that God designed into these organisms the ability, when they don't need a certain feature, it's switched off. They're paying attention to environmental clues, and the DNA actually adapts automatically, so it doesn't take lots of generations for these creatures to change. But we can say, therefore, that the DNA for the wings got damaged or switched off or something. It's breaking something or a defect, but it helps the beetle to do better in this particular environment. And yet it's still not a gain of information, it's a loss of information, or just the design feature that switches off and not a loss at all. Either way, it's not new information arising. So we've looked at three arguments for evolution: vestigial structures, similarities in living things, change in living things. Let's look at one more briefly. That is the cruelty in nature. Cruelty in nature, that doesn't sound like a scientific argument, and it's not. It's a theological argument against creation. But it goes like this. Have you folks ever watched these nature documentaries on BBC or PBS, Nova, and been discouraged how oftentimes the narrator will credit evolution and never give God the glory for these things? Well, one of the most common narrators on many of these documentaries would be Sir David Attenborough, has this marvelous British voice. And Attenborough himself is a thoroughgoing evolutionist and does that very thing. He doesn't give glory to the Creator. And so many Christians have actually written letters to Attenborough complaining about this, and Attenborough has a ready response. Here's what he says. When creationists talk about God creating, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers, and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in Africa that's going to make him blind. And I ask those creationists, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is an all-merciful God who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying God created this parasitic worm? If he's the designer, didn't he design the parasites to be parasites? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with the God who's full of mercy. Now, I think that is a sober challenge from the likes of somebody of David Attenborough, and many Christians might not know how to respond to this. But I think we can respond because it's not true that God, when he first made the world, put parasites in it. He made a good world that's been changed since the fall. And so the fall is a key to answering this question. Many of the harmful features in nature, like disease-causing organisms, viruses, bacteria, most viruses actually in our bodies perform good, healthy functions. We need them there. They're designed for productive things. Same with bacteria. Most bacteria are good. It's a subset that go rogue. And there is evidence that many of these, you can see how they changed over time. Parasites as well. Started out as a good creature that didn't need to rely on something else, a host organism, but maybe some of its genetic instructions got corrupted, and so it became something like a parasite over time. And so that's not really a problem for a Bible-believing Christian who takes Genesis at face value and believes that God set up the world good to begin with, but things got corrupted after God cursed the ground, after Adam's sin. I like the illustration another well-known creationist gives about when he went to a particular museum where there were all these Greek and Roman statues that a crowd was standing around admiring. And so the crowd was just marveling, saying, "It's magnificent, incredible, beautiful." But then there was a little boy standing nearby that overheard them, and he said, "What are you folks talking about? It looks broken to me." Well, there's truth in both of those ideas, right? A statue can exhibit exquisite artistry and yet be broken. And the application for us is, when we look at the world today, we Christians often want to convince non-believers that this world is amazingly well designed. Can't you see from beautiful sunsets and orchids and sunflowers, the beautiful things like Attenborough talked about, right? That it's a magnificent, amazing world, demands a designer. But the non-believer, the atheist, says, "What are you guys talking about? It looks broken to me. There's so much horror in the world, these parasites like Attenborough talked about." But do you see how that's actually not contrary to what we should expect if the Bible's history is true? The Bible can explain both the beauty and the ugliness, the good and the evil, because it says God is good, but he's allowed evil temporarily, and yet he's defeated that at the cross. So there is an answer to the brokenness, the ugliness, the sin, the evil in the world. We need to remember that God is not only creator, but he's also the Redeemer, who's set in motion plans to fix this world. Through the work that Jesus did on the cross. In Colossians 1, we read that, "For it pleased the Father that in him, in Jesus, all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross." Notice that. Jesus didn't just come to die to save us out of this world, but he's going to remake the world one day. He's going to restore, reconcile all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So that's the good news. So we've looked tonight at how there are 4 reasons allegedly to accept evolution. Actually, these are better evidences for the truth of creation. We talked about vestigial structures. There may be vestiges here and there, but the vast majority of things turn out to have functions after all, and we shouldn't make this argument from ignorance that evolutionists do. Then we looked at the similarities in living things. We've seen that they point to a common designer, not common ancestry for all these organisms. Third, the changes that we can observe today, these are changes within kinds, and they're not information-gaining changes, even when they're beneficial. They're through losses of information, or sometimes just sorting out the information that God had there to begin with. Last, the cruelty in nature is not evidence that there's no God of love, but that it's the result of his judgment on our sin. The bottom line, then, is that living things still shout design. I submit the more you look at the details, the more obvious it is that God is creator. And so we should get to know those details, learn to defend our faith, and learn to answer the claim that evolution is proven fact. So we have a number of resources that I mentioned before that can help you to do that. Our Creation magazine, if you didn't subscribe this morning, the sign-up forms are still on the book tables that you can check out after we dismiss. And in the magazine, we often feature amazing animals that exhibit God's handiwork, like the mimic octopus. You might know that other octopuses can change their skin to camouflage themselves, but the mimic octopus actually impersonates other creatures, up to 15 or more. It'll imitate a lionfish or a sea snake, and a lot of times it's pretending to be something poisonous that other sea creatures don't want to mess with. So if you want to check out videos online of the mimic octopus, it's amazing to watch it transform its skin and color and shape in real time. We also have some other resources, one for high school or college students that would be great, help them to survive the onslaught of evolutionary propaganda that they'll get in the classroom. The Creation Survival Guide gives them some practical tips, do's and don'ts in the classroom. One of my favorite videos that we produced is this documentary, Evolution's Achilles Heels, features 15 Bible-believing PhD scientists, and they're critiquing evolution on a scientific basis, not just quoting Bible verses, but helping to show that the science challenges evolution, and not just in biology, but geology and cosmology as well. So we have a fantastic website, creation.com, and I'll leave you with one verse before we go into question and answer time that I think is relevant to this design argument. Here in Hebrews 3, we read that, "For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God." Evolutionists want to give the credit to nature alone and no creator, but the design that everybody can observe in living things is not an illusion. The more you examine these details, the more clear it becomes that creatures are the handiwork of their creator. All right. So that's all I have for this hour. Thank you all for your attention. Why don't I just, thank you. Let me pray, and then we will go right into the Q&A time. If you need to get up and use the bathroom or something, feel free, but we're just going to go straight into it without a break. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the witness of your word and the witness of nature around us that testifies not only to your existence, but your invisible attributes and your glory. And we just give you praise for all the amazing things that you allow us to experience in the world around us. And we ask that you would help us to just see more clearly, understand your word better, and to love you more, and to be good ambassadors as we share the truth with our non-Christian friends, neighbors, and family members. So be with us in the coming days ahead, and we just give all the glory and praise to you, Lord. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Okay, so I think Lee's going to come around with a microphone. If you have a question, just raise your hand, I guess, and then I'll call on you, and he'll come and find you with the mic. All right, we got one up in the front here.
Help me with the terminology here. What is a DNA molecule chain?
Yeah.
Molecule?
It is a molecule, the DNA
Okay.
molecule, yeah.
Okay. Is there a standard length for the molecule?
Oh boy, it's incredibly long. If you add up like all the DNA is bundled into big sections called chromosomes in our cells, and it's dynamic through time. It's not staying static. It's sometimes chopping little bits apart and repairing mutations and reading it, and sometimes it'll unwind it, and then a reader passes along and then it re-stitches it back together. And the chromosomes change over time and things like that too. But we have, 23 pairs of chromosomes in human beings, human DNA in each cell. But if you sort of unwound, and it's also coiled, right? So DNA itself is a double helix. It's already kind of this spiral staircase-like structure. But then the DNA strand itself is coiled into supercoils and different things like that. But if you sort of unwound all the chromosomes and stretched it out, I should know this statistic, but I want to say in one cell, it would be many, many feet, if I remember. I could be way off, but I want to say one of your cells worth of DNA would be longer than this room, probably. And then if you have, and maybe some of the scientists can correct me if I'm wrong on, I might be, you'll have to just Google it. 2 meters? Okay. And then if you had all the DNA in all of our cells, it would reach to the moon and back many times, I think does that sound right to anybody? Don't quote me on that without fact checking. But yeah, does that sort of answer what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm trying to picture the, I see a lot of shows that forensic files,
Yeah.
for example, that say that here's how they look at the DNA, and so they produce a graph, I guess that's what, or a chart that shows all these little dots on it, but it's always an 8.5 by 11 or piece of paper.
Okay.
And so I just wondered whether the DNA of say, a dog is the same length as the DNA for a human. Yeah. And
As far as dogs and humans, I don't know, but there are some organisms that have like way more DNA, and we don't entirely know why. Some plant, I think ferns have a huge genome, much larger, and a genome would refer to like all of the DNA in an organism. So, like your total library of DNA, and ferns have like much more than humans do, and it doesn't seem to correlate with like, we seem to be much more complex than ferns, and yet they have much more DNA. Some of that with certain plants might be due to sometimes their chromosomes can get duplicated. It's a thing called polyploidy. I'm not sure if that's the case with the fern. I think there's rice might be a huge genome. So they don't follow some like neat pattern that evolutionists might expect necessarily. Yeah, if that's maybe the kind of thing you're getting at. And in terms of like maybe one relevance of the size of our genomes, DNA is like the most dense information storage system. Like computer scientists envy how dense, how much information is contained in such a small space, and they're even trying to study DNA so they can make computers like based on how that's done, as opposed to how we do it now with microchips and things. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Did I know? Okay.
Yeah.
Love to hear what your thoughts are on carbon dating, because that's seems like that's like a key component on supporting evolution.
Yeah. Great question. Okay, so, and I was talking about this with someone, I think either this morning or earlier, just before we began tonight. So we certainly answer this in our materials. If you want to check out, there are articles online or in the Creation Answers book. It's chapter 4. What about carbon dating? And it's a really great, easy to understand introduction to that, and how, ironically, carbon dating actually helps to support the case I'm making that the Earth is young. So first, I'll explain more broadly than carbon dating. A lot of times when people ask about carbon dating, they're asking about radiometric dating methods in general. And there's not just carbon dating, but lots of potassium, argon, and uranium, lead. All these methods are looking at the way atoms, certain atoms are stable. Others, that means they don't change over time, they stay consistent. Others are radioactive, meaning they're unstable, and what they do is spit out little particles, and that makes them transform from one type of atom into a different kind. And when we study how fast that takes place, it happens at apparently a known rate, so we can use it as a clock, if we know what the original amount was in the fossil or whatever we're trying to date, and then measure it in the present, then we can work out how long it took for that process to happen. But I would say first, all of these radiometric dating methods, although much of the science behind them is very good and the measurements are very accurate, the problem with them is that you have to make assumptions in order to calculate a date. There's no way to directly measure time. We don't have time machines. And so all of these methods have to make at least one, sometimes more, assumptions. So let me illustrate how the assumptions work. And there are more than just radiometric dating methods. There are many other processes that change with time. We have a good article on our site called 101 Scientific Evidences for a Young Age of the Earth and Universe. So these are other types of methods that are things that change with time. You can use those as a clock, and they actually contradict the millions and billions of years, and they support a young age of these things. And those are the ones that most people haven't heard about. But whether the method supports a young Earth or suggests an old Earth, all of them make assumptions that can be challenged. So here's how the assumptions work. If you walk into a bathroom where there's water dripping out of the faucet and filling up the tub at a certain rate, and I want you to figure out how long did it take for the water to rise to the current level. So what would you have to do to calculate an age or a date? You have to measure how much water is in the tub. So let's say you calculate it's 10 gallons, and then you also measure the rate at which the water is coming out of the tap, right, out of the faucet. And let's say it's 2 gallons per hour. So 10 gallons in the tub. The rate dripping down is 2 gallons per hour. Can anyone tell me how long did it take to fill up the tub? 10 divided by 2 is 5 hours, right? Is that the true age? Maybe, but maybe not, because we had to make assumptions to calculate the age. What assumptions did we make? You want to name some? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first there's two assumptions. First you discounted the evaporation rate of water coming in. You assume that the tub is filling up with the stopper in place. All right?
Yep.
So those are two right off the bat.
Yeah, so that would be, we could encompass a whole range of assumptions under one umbrella, and that would be to say we assumed it was a closed system. That means no interference from water leaving, water going in from a different source, right? So evaporation, a leak at the drain, somebody pouring in water from a bucket that didn't come from the faucet, right? Any of those things would have thrown off our calculation. So closed system, that's one big assumption. What others can you think of? Somebody else, yeah. Okay, in like from the faucet, right? So has the rate been constant would be another. We measured it in the present. We didn't actually exist through the whole time to confirm that the rate stayed steady, okay? Third assumption would be initial conditions. Did we start from zero? That's what our calculation assumed, but what if there was water in the tub before the faucet even got turned on or the leak started at the faucet, right? And now those are three categories of assumptions that also apply to radiometric dating methods. With carbon dating in particular, it seems like the bad assumption is the initial conditions. So carbon dating actually is not something you would use to date things like dinosaur bones. Dinosaur bones are supposed to be millions of years old, but carbon dating, even if it works like they say, then it would only go back to maybe maximum of around 100,000 years. So it's used for more recent objects, like in archaeology, it's used to date a lot of artifacts there. But why are there bad assumptions about the initial conditions? Well, what they assume is, how do we know how much of the radioactive carbon was in the fossil when it first got buried? They assume by calculating how much is in the atmosphere today, the ratio of radioactive to regular carbon, and it's basically 1 out of every 1.2 trillion carbon atoms is radioactive, so a tiny fraction, 1 out of every 1.2 trillion. They say that's what it is today, but because we know the world is very old, there's a steady state with the atmosphere retains that same number throughout time. So if we're looking at artifacts that are tens of thousands of years old, the starting clock, we assume 1 out of 1.2 trillion carbon atoms is radioactive. How do we know that's the case? We don't, and we have good reason actually to say it's not the case because the Genesis flood would naturally upset the carbon balance of the world by burying all kinds of creatures that contain carbon all at the same time, and that's what's produced our coals and oils and different things like that. But beyond that, I would say, and sorry I'm taking a long time on this question, but I think it's a good one that lots of people wonder about. Ironically, well, let me say first, and you can show how many of these radiometric dating methods, the assumptions are demonstrably wrong when you date objects of known age. Some of the older, the methods that give you millions or billions of years, they've dated lava from recent volcanoes that we know when the eruption took place, and then you use a dating method on it, and it gives you an age that's much, much older in terms of millions of years and so forth. And so in practice, when the scientists are dating things in the field, it's much more important to them working out like what they know from the field evidence as opposed to trusting a date from the lab. If the date from the lab comes back with some wildly different date than what they expect, they throw it out. They can always change the assumptions and say, oh, maybe it got contaminated or this happened in the past to affect it. And so they don't accept it in practice. And so you can see why, although there's a lot of good science involved, your bias can make you throw out even what would otherwise be, good data. So the last point I'll make is that, ironically then, coming back to carbon dating, because it's only used for younger ages, because it's got a shorter half-life, it would all be gone. If the whole Earth were carbon-14, which is the radioactive kind, after 1 million years, it would all decay away and be transformed into nitrogen. And so carbon dating isn't used for things that are supposed to be millions of years old, like dinosaur bones. And yet, if we use carbon dating on these things that contain carbon, like dinosaur bones do sometimes, it will give you an age of tens of thousands of years. So I don't think that age is accurate as an absolute age, but what it shows is the claims that they're dated to be much older by other dating methods. These two dating methods are now in conflict. Which one do we believe? I think the carbon dating is much more trustworthy, because if you find significant amounts of radioactive carbon in these samples, it tells you that they've got to be much younger, or the carbon would be all gone and no longer detectable. So long-winded answer, there's more on our website if you want to go even deeper than that. All right, got some over in this direction.
Am I on? I'm on. Can I assume something about you?
You can try, yeah.
Okay. I'm assuming
Yeah.
that that you are an ambassador for Christ, and he's making his appeal through you.
Yeah.
Okay, can I assume that?
Yes.
Okay. Everybody in here is an ambassador for Christ,
Yeah.
as if God was making his appeal through us, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you...
Assuming we're a believer, yeah. I think that
Assuming we're
applies
believers.
to believers,
Okay,
yeah.
assuming we're believers, okay. How often, when you share your faith, present the gospel to someone,
Yeah.
do they ask about creation? Honestly.
Yeah, we've got a guy on our staff that's does a lot more evangelistic work than me, and he says this sort of thing comes up all the time. You know, particular things about evolution being a stumbling block and so forth. In my experience, not a ton. I would say, you know, a minority of the cases. So it might just depend on the kind of people that you're dialoguing with and so forth. You know, I would say I do see it as one of the big stumbling blocks that often prevents people from coming to the Lord, but it might not even be one that's like on the surface of their minds directly. It's more like this general sense they have that science has discredited the Bible. All the smart people know it, you know. But if you ask them why they don't believe, they might not immediately say, well, fossils or evolution or something like that. You know, it just depends on a case-by-case basis. So, and you can say, maybe you're getting at something else, but I'll just say this and then go back to you, that I think when we are like dialoguing with people in individual circumstances, we should ask them the question of what their stumbling blocks are and then try to remove those. So if evolution is not a hurdle for somebody, I wouldn't necessarily bring it up, or something as controversial as the age of the earth, right? Like, I don't try to tell non-Christians like, hey, you need to believe the earth is young and before you come to Christ, right? Like, I would just check with them. Like, if they say I'm not a believer, then I say, okay, yeah, like tell me about, have you ever considered like the evidence for God, or you know that Jesus rose from the dead, or why aren't you a Christian? You know, and then take the conversation from there. But yeah, but are you getting at something specific, or does that kind of address what you're?
The only thing is, I share my faith. I'm not trying to, look at, some super saint. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm a sinner saved by grace.
Yeah.
Okay? But I do share my faith. And I have yet to have a conversation about creation.
Huh. All right,
I use the New Testament, 7 verses in the New Testament, and they never ask me about creation.
Yeah.
Just,
Well, that's good.
Well, that's why I ask you how often it happens to you.
Yeah. We do like, there definitely are many people that it is that do bring it up. We sometimes, like on college campuses, I'm not sure where you're witnessing, but we have some articles about people going out, and they say it's a major issue that does come up often. But I was going to add one other thing. What was it? It's escaped me now. But yeah, fair enough. Oh, I know what it was. Just part of what I'm doing here too is not merely to equip us to evangelize, but also for Christians to have confidence. Even if we already believe, apologetics, I think, can help to cement our faith and help us to fall in love with God more deeply. So there are multiple purposes for why I do what I do. Yeah.
I agree more about that
Yeah.
than about someone else.
All right. Fair enough.
It just confirms my faith.
Yeah. Great. Good deal. All right. Who else?
bring them back.
You kind of answered this a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to get a little bit more of a clarification on it. So the text in Genesis 1 kind of, does that require an actual literal interpretation of days as 24-hour periods?
Yeah.
Or can it be understood through like different genres like poetry or metaphor?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
I
the
think
first question.
A lot of things that could be said about that. As far as the genre, some of our materials, like the commentary we have on Genesis 1-11, go into that, and why we don't think Genesis should be understood as poetry. It's definitely a text written as narrative. It has some of the hallmarks of narrative, that you find some of the verb forms that I won't go into the technicalities there, but it starts, Genesis 1:1, for example, has a certain type of verb, and then it changes the type of verbs that are there, and Genesis 1 is peppered with like, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's a Hebrew construction called a vav consecutive. Vav is the letter for and. I guess I am going into some of the technicalities, but there's more depth than that. But anyway, and it's giving you like a sequence of events, right? And just like you can see in the patriarchal narratives that follow in Genesis 12 onward, it's the same sort of literature that doesn't like radically change there. Even though Genesis 1 is kind of has some like repetitive things to it, it still shouldn't be understood as poetry, we don't think, because if you look at Hebrew poetry in the Psalms, there are some Psalms that talk about creation, but they're structured very differently. They often exhibit a feature called parallelism that you can see in Proverbs and in Psalms. What parallelism is you'll have two lines as a couplet, and what's called synonymous parallelism is when you have it say the same thing two different ways. So I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I have one in my head that's the opposite, where you've got what's called antithetical parallelism. You say one statement, and then you say something that's kind of the opposite of it, like the righteous are as bold as a lion, but the wicked flee when no one pursues, I think is how that proverb goes. So you see how it's like contrasting the righteous and boldness with the wicked and cowardice. Those are the kind of features that we see in Hebrew poetry. Psalm 104 would be a good example of a psalm that's about creation, and it's got a very different type of structure than Genesis 1. And then, but just the fact that it's a narrative also, doesn't entail that it's history, and we think that it's historical because of the things that it's describing and the way the later biblical authors understand it as like there really was an Adam and Eve, and his sin impacted the real world. So he's not just a symbol or a literary device, right? And then as far as the days in Genesis 1, we do think that it's taking the context clues. That's what helps us to know that the days are calendar days as opposed to ages. Because in Hebrew, just like in English or Greek, the word day can have multiple meanings. It's got a wide semantic range, but in any particular instance, you can't just arbitrarily choose one of those meanings and insert it into the text. You have to determine the meaning from the context, right? So like in English, we say, in my father's day, it was like this. Well, there we're talking about not a specific literal day, but a time period, right? You use it in a prepositional phrase. And the Genesis 2 actually does that very thing. It says, in the day that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. Some translations say when God created the heavens and the earth. It's just an idiom for in the basic general time that God created. That's in Genesis 2. But in Genesis 1, notice the context clues there was evening and there was morning one day. There was evening and there was morning a second day. So a day it's composed of an evening and a morning, and they're numbered in a sequence. And so all these kinds of clues tell you, I think, that they're ordinary days. Plus you've got theological points about why did God take 7 days to create and rest on the seventh? He blessed the seventh day and declared it holy. Then when you get to the time where God reveals the 10 Commandments to Moses in Exodus 20, it says that he blessed the Sabbath. It calls it the Sabbath. So the word Sabbath is not used in Genesis 1 or 2, but why is he declaring the day holy and blessing it, and he rested on it? It's as a pattern for people to follow, like establishing that Sabbath rest on the seventh day. I don't think it was an obligatory command until the time of the Exodus and the Ten Commandments and so forth, but it was like an established pattern from the time of creation. And so if God took 6 days and rested for one as a pattern for our work week, then that also is an indication that they're real day, like calendar days, right, of a normal week, a 7-day week. Yeah, and lots more could be said about that, but that's probably plenty on. I've gone on long enough on that question too, so good one.
And then the second question I had was regarding the age of the earth, as how could the early biblical authors have understood the concept of ancient earth or geological time, which was only discovered within the last 250 years?
Well, I don't think they were like less intelligent than us or incapable of or having those concepts. In fact, people in those times did have concepts of an extremely ancient or eternal world. That wasn't the view of the Hebrews, who believed that in the beginning, there was a beginning, right, when God created the heavens and the earth, but other cultures around them did believe in, ancient times. And they could have used like simple language, like expressing like there have been as many days as the sands on the seashore, or they had words for different like lengthy time periods, and they expressed that about God, how he's from ancient time, the Ancient of Days. And olam, I think, is a Hebrew word that can mean like either eternity or just like kind of perpetually. And you see that used throughout the Old Testament. So they had the vocabulary and the understanding that I think they could have grasped that concept if that's what God had meant to communicate, But what I'm arguing for is the opposite, that he told them that he created in 6 days just thousands of years ago, rather than saying the world was ancient. So great questions.
I was just going to make a comment about the Exodus 20:11. It says, in 6 days God created the heavens, the earth, and all that's in them. And for there, and you mentioned something about geologic time. Again, there's assumptions that they make, that they assume the layers were done slowly over time and nothing changes. But we have so much evidence for cataclysmic events that could put down many layers in a very short time. So a part of that is how the assumption you make going into looking at the data.
Yeah, good enough. I don't need to add anything to that, but you've got sound booth if you want.
We got an online question, actually.
Oh, all right.
So how do you think the evolution undermines the authority and sufficiency of the scriptures?
Yeah, that was something, if they caught the presentation I gave in the morning, I made a case there that there's some theological problems with embracing evolution and an old earth, and I talked about how at the end of the 6th day, God calls the creation very good. And if you believe in evolution, then you're saying the fossils are millions of years old, dinosaurs went extinct before Adam and Eve. And so if God used millions of years to create, maybe he even used evolution, then you're saying he used this process of death and disease and suffering, painful bone cancer we find in dinosaur bones, and then he calls that very good. And how does that make sense of the very good world that God is saying? I think it is kind of an attack on the goodness of God, his character, and also the whole biblical big picture narrative that says we started out with God making a paradise free from death, and how did death enter the world because of Adam's sin? And so, and this is just one of, I think we could raise other problems, but that's one of the big ones in my mind, that to try to embrace evolution and Christianity at the same time. I'm not saying that makes someone a non-Christian. I think there are genuine Christians who have embraced evolution. I just think they're being inconsistent on that point, because I think the scripture is clear enough when it teaches us things about creation that you have to sort of explain those away, reinterpret Genesis and things and not take it at face value. But the New Testament writers, for instance, took Genesis as history. Jesus refers to events in Genesis, and other New Testament writers do. And here's like one good example of this. Jesus In Mark, this was also a passage I shared about this morning, but let me now elaborate on it. When Jesus defends marriage, it's two parallel passages, Matthew 19 and Mark 10. The Pharisees ask him a question about divorce, and Jesus says, basically, he says, here's the way marriage was from the beginning of creation when God established it, when he made Adam and Eve. And he quotes from Genesis 1 and 2. But what he says there is, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Well, how then did Jesus understand, the length of time we'd been around? Did he believe that the earth had a long natural history without human beings here for millions and billions of years, and then human beings finally arrived on the scene in the last million years or so, hundreds of thousands of years ago? If he believed that, why would he say from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female? He's talking about the beginning of all of history, of the creation of the whole universe, and there were people there from that time. Do you see how his words don't make sense if he embraced the modern view about billions of years? The universe, 18 billion years old, Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, but then human beings came on the last little tail end, and then he says they were here from the beginning of creation. To me, that doesn't make sense, and it suggests Jesus believed in this, straightforward view of Genesis at a young age timeline. And a number of other, verses use similar language about people here from the foundation of the world. And so that's one thing that theistic evolutionists would have to, explain away somehow. And there are many other problems. Here's just one more. Oftentimes they have a hard time believing that God actually rested and finished his work of creation at the end of the sixth day and then rested on the seventh, because they say, what was his means of creation? It's through these natural processes that bring about living things. It's through evolution, and evolution is still happening. It's not ceased. So in what sense has God stopped, long ago, refraining from creation? They say the work of creation is still ongoing. I actually wrote an article about that people can find about God's rest, a problem for evolution, theistic evolution, on our website, and it goes into depth and quotes many of these theistic evolutionists. They profess Christianity, but then they say, God's still creating. He's never stopped. So, well, what do you do with the text in Genesis that says he finished his work and then he rested? So lots of detailed problems like that, but great question. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about a wingless beetle. I can't remember the island that it was on. Could you refresh my memory on that?
I don't remember the particulars on that, but it's something Darwin himself observed. So it might have been on the Galapagos, or it might have been somewhere else on his travels.
But that brings to mind a book that I read a long time ago called Genetic Entropy. Mm-hmm. And so it's the accumulation of mutations to successful generations after that.
Yeah.
And so applying that to the human race, we got people telling us we've been around for hundreds of millions of years, but with the accumulation of all these mutations going on from one generation to the next, that can't be possible. Is there any material on your website that would substantiate that position?
Yeah, we carry that book, I believe, or at least we did at one time. I think it's still available on our website.
Okay, it was written by Sanford, if I remember correctly?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so if people aren't familiar with this concept, let me explain. So John Sanford was, where was he at? Cornell or someplace. He was an atheist, a non-believer, and then came to Christ and eventually became a full-on young earth creationist. And he had expertise in genetics, and he did well for himself by inventing something called the gene gun and patented that and so forth. But anyway, he wrote this book called Genetic Entropy. It's kind of a nerdy scientific name, but the basic concept is really fascinating, and it's a strong scientific support for this perspective I've been making a case for. And the basic idea is what you said, that in many organisms, but let's take humans as an example, mutations are accumulating so rapidly in every individual, and therefore the population as a whole, that even with severe natural selection to try to weed out the worst mutations, you can't get rid of them. So every generation becomes more mutant than the one before, and it would naturally lead to our extinction in a short amount of time. And that's suggestive of we can't have been here for as long as the evolutionists say. and lots of other problems it prevents for them. It shows that evolution can't happen either, because natural selection is impotent, if you will, to even overcome this harmful deterioration, let alone help us to, generate new functions in our genome. It's the scientists estimate there's about 100 new mutations in our gametes, so the ones that'll be passed on to the next generation, not just like skin mutations, but about 100 new mutations per person every generation. So like you have 100 more of these mutations in you than your parents did, and then the next generation will add 100 more to that, and every generation 100 more, and it would rapidly cause us to go extinct, and it's very a strong indication that we can't evolve, and we can't have been here for several million years, depending on how you define human beings. Yeah.
When I was a boy, I walked in science class,
Yeah.
and I saw this. Everybody's probably seen this poster before. The little monkey, chimpanzee, gorilla, Cro-Magnon man,
Yeah.
then Homo sapien, right? This
Yeah.
big, and even as a small boy, I would look at that. Something's wrong there.
Yeah.
Something's wrong there. So I'm going to ask you this question. If we evolved, as the evolutionist says,
Yeah.
from a monkey or something like that, why are there still monkeys? Why haven't they become Homo sapiens?
Yeah.
What's their argument?
Yeah, so actually, that's an argument we say. So we've got a whole page on our website dedicated to arguments we recommend creationists not use, and that is actually one of them. Because the first part of your statement I liked. I think that what's sometimes called the ape parade. The ape leading up to the modern day human step by step. Many evolutionists have even criticized that and said it's kind of misleading because they don't believe in a straight lineage. Now, I think, well, it's not, sure, they would believe that that's just like one small fragment of a larger evolutionary tree. But we can criticize the individual things and show how, in the fossil record, there are characteristic humans and apes, and there's a large gap between them. And we could talk about individuals. Like this morning, I talked about Neanderthals, and I could talk about the others, Homo erectus and Australopithecines and so forth, and show how Australopithecines are apes, and Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Cro-Magnon, all human. But the question about why are there still apes, or why are there still monkeys, or why chimpanzees still today, I think it's kind of subtly misunderstanding what evolutionists claim. So, for example, they don't say that humans evolved from chimpanzees. They would say humans and chimpanzees are modern organisms. They both evolved from a common ancestor that was not quite either of those. And is it a surprise that we would have either that common ancestor today or the chimpanzees? Not really, because I descended from my grandparents, but my grandparents could still be alive for a while, or the lineage that they gave rise to, my cousins are still around, even though I'm here at the same time. So it's the idea that the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, these ape-like creatures, well, they have gone extinct, in fact. But even if they had persisted kind of unchanged, in evolution, it would be like a subset of those split off, and this smaller population became human beings, while the others continued being apes, if that makes sense. So it's not a difficulty to say that that some of these creatures could still be around. That wouldn't be inconsistent with their theory, but there are plenty of big problems with human evolution, and it's more to do with just is there good evidence that humans could have undergone the thousands and thousands of changes that it would take to transform an ape-like creature into a human being? Those are radical changes, and even 7 million years is not enough time, and it's not documented in the fossil record. The claims they make, we have lots of criticisms of those fossil bones, and you can read about that in our literature or books that we've produced and so on. So yeah. Yeah. And that is, actually, it's our most visited page. There's a whole range of things that we cover there about arguments we recommend people not use. It's one of the most popular parts of our website. So, yeah. All right, anybody else? And I'm just going to rely on Lee to cut me off when it's time to quit.
Oh yeah, 2 a.m. is fine. No, I'm just kidding.
All right, perfect.
We'll stop at 8.
Has there been any evidence that they found for? Well, I should back up. But back in school, I was taught that the dinosaurs went extinct because a massive impact with the Earth, throwing up ash and debris into the atmosphere, causing their extinction. Has there been any evidence that science has been able to support that theory?
Yeah, possibly. I think. I've looked at that many times. This is one area I should know better than I do because I've read stuff that creationists have written on it, and for some reason, it's one I have a hard time remembering what all the creationist perspectives are on it. But I think there are a range of views even among creationists on that. Now, since we believe, like the Chicxulub crater that they point to and the iridium layer that's in some of these layers with dinosaurs that might point to an asteroid impact, meteor impact, connected to this, we would say those features are in flood era rocks. So we don't subscribe necessarily to the view that if that meteor impact did in fact take place and cause the Chicxulub crater and deposit the iridium, we wouldn't say therefore it's the reason dinosaurs went extinct, because we think they survived on the ark until the post-flood world. But as far as whether there actually was an impact like that, I think creationists are somewhat divided from my vague memory about that. Yeah, so there is some evidence that might point to that, but at least the impact. But I don't think we use it to explain dinosaur extinction. But even evolutionists, many of them are skeptical about it. It seems to be the mainstream position, the one that's always presented in popular literature. But there are difficulties with it, like. It was, supposedly, like you said, causing catastrophic climate change that killed off many creatures at once. But in the same layers with dinosaurs, we have creatures that would seem to be very susceptible and die out that didn't. Like we find frogs and salamanders and crocodiles and snakes and lizards. And some of those, like the salamanders and frogs, they would seem like, why didn't they go extinct? And just that selectively killed off other creatures. And so it's kind of a mystery for them. And they've come up with dozens of theories about what might have caused the demise of dinosaurs. They don't know for sure, but neither do we. Well, we do the same thing they do, where we propose ideas consistent with our worldview and the best science, and nobody knows for sure. But there are endangered species programs because animals go extinct all the time, right? Like passenger pigeon, Tasmanian tiger, dodo bird, all in relatively recent years. So there are lots of reasons animals go extinct: predators, food source becoming scarce, climate change, that can all contribute. Yeah, good question.
I have a question.
I think it is addressed in the Titans book. I think there's probably a chapter on that, the big book with the dinosaur on the cover called Titans. I'm pretty sure would address it. Go ahead.
So going back to like bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics, is it true that most of those mutations are sterile and they can't reproduce, and that's why they haven't gone farther?
I'm not sure I follow what you mean.
Are a lot of mutations sterile, unable to reproduce?
Like causing the sterility of the organism? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like donkeys, are they able to reproduce? Like 2 donkeys?
I think mules are sterile, if memory serves, but not always. Actually, I've heard that like the vast majority are, but occasionally you get one that can go on to reproduce. So yeah, if you're speaking more about like
MRSA or that's resistant to antibiotics.
Yeah. No, I don't think that has anything to do with like those I might not be as familiar with the specifics there, like being not one of the scientists. Like our biologist on staff would be able to answer that probably a lot better than me. But no, I think the very fact that they're resistant and multiplying shows that they're not they're able to multiply, right?
Well, they're like an organism, so they're not actually reproducing, they're just growing bigger. So like a lot of cancers in us, they're not actually reproducing, they're just growing bigger. 'Cause they
Maybe,
can't
maybe with like
reproduce.
tumors or something like that. But asking about bacteria do asexually
They have
reproduce.
colonies, like MRSA is a bacterial colony.
Okay.
I don't know, never mind.
Yeah, I think somebody else chime in on that if you know. I mean, yeah, don't bacteria just like asexually reproduce? And I think that's the idea that the antibiotics will kill off the ones that are not mutant, is what's happening, right? They're susceptible, but there are some that have a mutation that causes them to, for whatever reason, to be able to resist. And so those are the ones that go on multiplying. The antibiotic might only kill off the wild type, while the mutant is able to resist then. And so the evolutionists say, oh, see, that's bacteria evolving resistance because it came about by a mutation that changed them from the wild type that would be killed off. But the reason this is often, it's touted as an example of Darwinian evolution, but the reason it's not is because these are information losses, like I talked about. So the wild type, in the absence of the antibiotic, the wild type would actually be healthier. And the mutation, just it's very similar to the wingless beetle example I gave, where the mutation will allow it to overcome the antibiotic and not be affected by it, but only by destroying something else within the genome that was useful, not necessary for it to survive. So it's kind of like the weaker form is the one that survives better in the presence of the antibiotic. But take the antibiotic away, the wild type is the healthier, more robust one. And so it's not evolution because it's destroying these organisms in order to adapt, and that can't happen indefinitely and keep improving it. It's eventually you're gonna like wipe it out, Yeah. So good. All right.
One way to think about it is antibiotics is killing off the competition, and they would normally not survive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the mutants, sometimes we think, oh, they're mutated and they beat the antibiotics, so they're better. But no, they're actually weaker. They just have that one advantage in the one area, but overall they're weaker. So, all right, who else? We got 10 minutes.
So on the age of the Earth, the evolutionists will say it's about 14.6 billion years, but yet with the latest imagery we have of space, they're claiming that they're seeing galaxies that are, 95 billion light years away? How do they explain that?
Yeah, I haven't followed that super closely, but some of the latest images from, it's not even Hubble anymore. What's the James Webb telescope are, from the few things that I've read on it, the evolutionists were very surprised to find very mature galaxies very far away, because in their point of view, the further away you're looking with your telescopes, the further back in time you're going, because it takes light time to travel all that huge distance. So they expected, as we get further and further distance, you're going to be back closer and closer and closer to the time of the Big Bang. And in their view, it takes galaxies a lot of time to develop complex structures like spiral galaxies and so forth. And so they expected to see various features of these early galaxies that would demonstrate they were immature and hadn't been around for a long time. And yet, as far out as we've looked now, they keep finding very highly mature galaxies that, from their own point of view, would take a long time to develop. And so it's forced them to revise their understanding about the Big Bang, about how long ago it was, or how long it takes these galaxies to develop these features. So back to the drawing board to some extent on that.
Okay, here's our last question.
I've got someone that I listened to, and they were talking in argument towards evolution, and they were talking about, I think, of vestigial DNA thing, and it was about DNA it's like two papers that are glued together.
Okay.
And somehow, you're reading through the book and you have the information, but because these two are stuck together in a weird way, it's like a leftover vestigial DNA. Do they actually have an answer for why that happened? Or, because you were saying that they found like a purpose for all this vestigial DNA stuff. Do you happen to know that theory or that explanation?
I don't know the particular thing you're referencing. It could be a range of things that it made me think of. But I guess maybe I'll just talk about a bit more about junk DNA in general. We have lots of good articles on our site about what's called junk DNA, which is kind of like vestigial DNA in a sense, like you're saying. So again, I can't remember if I outlined that in this talk or this morning, but the evolutionary community for years has been saying that the vast majority of our DNA is worthless garbage left over from our evolutionary history and has no function. But they've had certain like major projects about, sequencing the human genome and then trying to understand it. One of those, the acronym for it was ENCODE, a major secular research project trying to understand what these various parts of DNA are doing that we never looked into before. Because the parts that we did understand, that the basic thing that DNA does is it gets translated. First it's transcribed into RNA, and then the RNA is translated into a protein. So like a gene would code for a protein, and then a protein gets folded up, and it's like a little machine that does something in our body or a structural feature or something. But much of this so-called junk DNA doesn't code for proteins. And so they said it's not doing that, so it's not doing nothing at all. But what the ENCODE project found is a lot of this so-called junk DNA is at least transcribed into RNA. And that would take a lot of, the cell's energy expenditure to go to the trouble of doing that. If it's really doing nothing, wouldn't the evolutionary process kind of weed out and get rid of, all this wasted effort? Why do you transcribe DNA that goes on to do nothing as RNA? And so they said that's a really strong sign that the DNA is doing something once it becomes an RNA, even if we don't know the functions always that the RNA has. Now, they have discovered also specific functions for a ton of it. They're realizing these things can like regulate other genes. Like, why do you have fingernails develop here rather than on your forehead or something like that? It's like helping to, because all the cells up here have the same DNA as the cells here, but there are all kinds of complex features, some encoded in the DNA and some in just like the structure of the cell. And there's all sorts of subcategories of junk DNA, like pseudogenes. Pseudogenes look like sometimes you have a copy of a gene that does code for a protein, but then you've got another one that looks very similar, like the same gene, but it's got something where it like switched off a part of it that we normally understand how it functions over here, but it looks like a mutation damaged and broke that. And it's just like a broken copy of this gene. But then the more that we research those pseudogenes, they're not pseudogenes. That's the name, we still call them, but they're not functionless. They're actually regulating the normal genes and all sorts of functions that they have. Whole books have been written about this by like Jonathan Wells has written a good book on junk DNA, tons of articles on our website. And Rob Carter, our biologist, pointed out, this isn't something evolutionists just believed because they were ignorant, but they actually need to have junk DNA because otherwise, if most of our genome is functional, to get all the changes between chimpanzees and humans, our common ancestor 7 million years ago, too many changes had to take place that were like functional in nature, like not just the changes to the gobbledygook, the junk DNA, but changes that were meaningful and functional. And without the junk DNA, it's far too many changes that they can account for by naturalistic processes. So they're kind of in a dilemma now. Like they can see junk DNA actually has function, but they still have a tendency to want to deny that it does, because otherwise, how do you account for the differences between us and the apes in 7 million years of evolution? It's not enough time to do that. So anyway, that's probably, more than you'll ever want to know about junk DNA. If you're a nerd and you want to know more, you can look up books and articles. So good. Thank you all for your attention, and yeah, hope you all have a good night.